Welcome, everyone, and hello. I'm Stephanie Rao, Executive Director for the National Council on Public History. NCPH is a membership association dedicated to helping public historians put history to work in the world through community building, programs, and scholarship. Thank you for joining us today for Remembering African American Service a Different Way. Today's presentation is our final installment of a four-part series exploring new scholarship related to the World War II home front, facilitated as part of the National Park Service's World War II Heritage City Program work. Before we get underway, I wanted to share a few housekeeping notes as we get started. This event has Zoom auto captions available, and to access those, hit the show captions at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. Feel free to use the Zoom chat area throughout the presentation today. Share where you're joining us from today. If you have thoughts or resources to share with our other attendees, you can share those there. And if you have any questions for our presenter today, if you could please enter those in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. That will help us keep track of them as we get to the end of the hour. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Emily Button-Cambick, National Coordinator for the American World War II Heritage City Program with the National Park Service, for some words of welcome and to introduce today's speaker. Emily?
Thank you, Stephanie. Hello, everyone, and welcome on behalf of the National Park Service. Thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to thank NCPH for their partnership in this webinar series, which has been great, and their broader partnership in expanding public history on the World War II homefront since Congress established the American World War II Heritage City Program in 2019. Today, we're excited to welcome our speaker, Tim Campbell, and he is currently based in sunny California, where he works full-time at a recently opened children's museum. He has a master's degree in history and is pursuing a PhD in museum services with hopes of landing a role at a Smithsonian or another history-focused museum when the time is right. Alongside his museum and history work, he's also a personal trainer and aspires to create documentaries on topics that align with his research interests. When he's not focusing on museums, history, or fitness, you can probably find him training for Muay Thai competitions, exploring the great outdoors, or taking an impromptu trip somewhere new. And Tim presented on the work you'll be hearing about today at an NCPH meeting a couple of years ago. And my colleagues and I thought it really exemplified the importance of oral history for understanding the human side of World War II, while highlighting the broader legacy of service and the movements toward integration after the war. So thank you to NCPH for providing this platform and Tim for sharing his research today.
Thank you. That was an absolutely amazing introduction. I don't think I've ever heard one that well before. I am Tim Campbell, as we already stated, and this is Remembering African American Service a Different Way. Alrighty, so just to give you an overview of how today is going to go, I'm going to give you a little bit more information about myself and my work that I have going on, and then we're going to hop right into the 477th story, and then we'll have that Q&A at the end. I do want to let you know now that I'm really big on context and using pictures and things like that. So as we're going through, you'll see pictures. If you want to know more information about that picture, just notate the number that's in the corner, and I can give you more information at the end if it's not one that I stop on and talk about expressly. They basically covered all of the good stuff about me, so I'm going to skip ahead to the end. But most recently, I was speaking at an Oral History Association conference a couple months ago, and I was also an award recipient there as well. And then I have TLC History, which is my public history business, where I do that oral history documentary work and the museum work. And then I also have a children's book and the query process right now that's going over topics about the Korean War. But enough about me, and on to the 477th. So on April 5th, 1945, members of the 477th Medium Bomb Group began a civil demonstration to push back against the illegal race-based policies of their commander, Colonel Robert Selway. On the first night of their demonstration, and multiple small groups, African-American officers from the 477th entered and requested service at the Instructors Officers Club at Freeman Field Air Base in Indiana, but group by group, they were arrested. The next night, the same thing occurred. But after 25 were arrested, the base commanding officer ordered the instructors club to be closed for the night. In total, 61 officers were arrested for the officers club demonstration, but that was nothing compared to the 101 who would mutiny against Selway's unjust demands the very next day. Now, sadly, this situation that I'm describing was not the first time or the last time the military faced a race-based demonstration or mutiny by service members, but the 477th experience offers significant context for race relations at home for service members during and after World War II. Now, someone being racist in the 1940s isn't surprising, but Selway's behavior was exactly what the federal government had been openly trying to address since 1939, because communist discourse about the hypocrisy of life for African American citizens was becoming popular, fueling fears of mass defection and/or an uprising if not properly managed. The image that you see in front of you now is one of those pieces of propaganda. There is some notation on it because I do not speak Russian, but it is basically poking at the idea of liberty, the idea of capitalism, and the idea of that American Christianity. If anything is clear from the congressional discourse at this time, no one had any idea what the best course of action was to address the realities of African American life, and they often found themselves deadlocked when trying to vote on the next step to rebut communist propaganda influencing the American and poor population. This propaganda included paintings, photographs, films, posters, advertisements, and illustrations that started spreading throughout the African diaspora after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, or if your school taught it to you as a Russian Revolution, it's the exact same thing, just post-World War I. Its main goal was to promote a raceless society and boost pride in its own people as they struggled to keep their country united. But it was effective, and sources from around the world discussed this topic at length. For the United States and many African Americans, communism became a popular topic in 1931 because the IRA, the USSR's International Red Aid, organized a campaign to free the Scottsboro Boys, 9 falsely accused African American boys found guilty in Alabama by an all-white jury. Then, in 1932, a Russian studio planned the feature-length film Black and White about the radicalization of Black workers in the American South. The story gets even better because they publicly hosted Langston Hughes and 21 other African Americans as script consultants early in the production process. They ultimately did not make the film, but this remains one of the coolest rabbit holes I have ever come across while doing this work, especially since it happened during the Great Depression, making the gesture even more of a jab. Furthermore, this is another example that race relations worldwide were already part of the conversation. Something traditional US history would suggest wasn't happening until the 1950s, at best maybe the late 1940s. Regardless of the Soviet Union's specific efforts, the question now for the US and its leadership is, how does the country and its officials manage an integration process on the eve of war while still reeling from the Depression? From the perspective of the African American population, what they settled on were moral and or symbolic victories that would appease the press. In practice, this meant federal changes, but their reported execution and outcomes were often far different from what happened. In fact, some of these differences we only know because late in life, veterans share their stories, and the recollections of entire units differ from what was reported. Take something like the Tuskegee Airmen. On paper and in the news, this was an amazing moment of progress. But being the first came with some undesired consequences and struggles that were supposed to be fixed, or at least taken into account because the country was genuinely trying to make progress with race relations. Now, to avoid stealing my own thunder later on, I'm going to stop myself and come back to this question more in depth later. But for these reasons and others, the creation of the Tuskegee Airmen flight groups and the accomplishments required of African American aviators before them to even give them the opportunity to be trusted to fly in general are why I argue their connection to the long civil rights movement and is what got me interested in making the experiences of veterans who served primarily stateside throughout the 20th century a specialty. I have to stop here because this is a famous photo. This picture is of Eleanor Roosevelt. If you don't know, she's a giant champion of change and had been through the entirety of the 20th century. She's awesome. But the way this story goes is they were going to see the civilian pilot training program where they had been training these African Americans to fly. Eleanor is just supposed to be up there taking pictures and things of that nature. She takes it upon herself to walk up the stairs, hop in Charles Anderson's plane, and then asking for a ride. No one wanted her to go around and fly, but she did with a smile on her face, as you see in this picture here. And it's one of my favorite things I've been able to find doing my research so far. The Tuskegee Airmen were formed after the success of the civilian pilot training program, which produced some of the first African American pilots who would later become the instructors for the Tuskegee Airmen, which is that part about people having to be successful before we even get to the Tuskegee Airmen. They did great in training, but despite their early success, African American pilots were still not respected or seen as intellectual equals by the military, and they were constantly reminded of this, even once they made it to serve in North Africa. In an attempt to earn this respect, or simply because they were tired of this treatment, these airmen wrote to Black-owned newspapers about their experiences. The New York Amsterdam News, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, and other news outlets published articles calling out the government for failing to follow through on programs they had created for African Americans, even when they exceeded expectations. In addition to news outlets, the NAACP continued its grassroots campaigning for African Americans' full inclusion in the armed services through the Double V campaign and plain old advocacy. The results of this pressure and a growing need to not appear divided to the USSR and other burgeoning world powers on the brink of World War was the 1940 Selective Training and Service Act. This established the first peacetime draft, but more importantly, its fine print created the 99th Pursuit Squadron, later consolidated with other units to form the 332nd, or the Red Tails, the group that the movie's about. Expanding on the creation of new units and opening up the draft, in June of 1941, President FDR issued Executive Order 8802, banning segregation in the defense industry. This legislation was prompted after FDR was publicly pressured by A. Philip Randolph, president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and organizer of the First March on Washington. The two leaders had been in contact through letters and private meetings months before Executive Order 8802 was signed, but feeling his concerns about African American employment in the defense industry were ignored, Randolph threatened and began organizing a march on Washington. I'm just going to pause here and go through a couple of these. This is the original article that was published in the newspapers that is starting that Double V campaign. Not going to insult your intelligence. I know you all can read there. The gentleman that you see featured in the bottom right there is who is credited with starting or creating that turn of phrase, the Double V campaign. And then the rest of the press kind of take off from there because what he's describing is a easy to understand situation. This one is a picture of individuals actually sitting outside of the Pittsburgh Courier's office and what I believe is one of their Chicago locations. I can't while we're here in this setting, but if you want, I can share the photo. If you really zoom in, you actually can see a lot of fun information about the Black community in this area on the pictures that are even just pinned to the board that they're looking at. Just showing you that they're stopping by the glass just to get their news for the week, the day, whatever it may be, is a part of the community. It's something that people have to do almost. This one is FDR as he is signing the Selective Service and Training Act. Nothing crazy here. And then this is the actual executive order itself. And then just once again, because as I expressed, she's my favorite, we see Eleanor once again down here standing next to A. Philip Randolph. And the person who's next to them is Mayor LaGuardia of New York. If you're familiar with who that is, he's kind of irrelevant in this situation, but it's just cool to see all of them standing in the same place. Many other historians also suggest that Randolph being in conversation with Eleanor was another large reason why they're able to get something like this done. And the point I wanted to make here is that with an executive order, at this time, presidents are only doing those if they feel like Congress can't come to a decision or they can't be together in that decision. So it's just easy if they do something that is unilateral. Now, there are checks and balances in place to make sure that this isn't ridiculous and it's not something that's used very popularly, but we see it used a lot through this decade and the next two, in all honesty, just because no one was in agreement on how are we supposed to handle these situations, but there was always pressure from other places to do something about the situation. And what you see pictured here is the 99th Pursuit Squadron, or a chunk of them, I should say. And then one of their instructors is in the back left there. So In response to the proposed march, in 1943, the War Department issued an order to remove colored and white signs marking public spaces on bases and in jobs fulfilling defense contracts, and that it would be ceasing to designate military units as segregated on paper. The units were still segregated. I don't have it here because it's a boring picture in my opinion, but if you scroll through the yearbooks at Fort Knox or Freeman or anywhere else, then you see that those units were all homogenous, or there's like one or two that are just sprinkled in somewhere, but it's typically an African American being sprinkled in another unit. It's never the latter. In July of 1944, the War Department expanded those federal mandates to include all government transportation, forbidding soldiers from being restricted to specific sections of government vehicles on or off base, regardless of local customs. These orders were intended to ease bases into the desegregation process and make for good publicity. Instead, it set the stage for African American service domestically to be a different kind of fight. And that publicity thing that I keep mentioning is why there are so many pictures from this time. Is why there are so many pictures of the Tuskegee Airmen just through this chunk. If you go towards the Korean War, the pictures start to look very different. They actually start being cropped by the military, and they start being very specific about what is actually allowed to make its way out to the media. But where does the 477th show up in all this? I know, I promise I'm getting there. This is the context. The 477th was created in response to the 99th Pursuit Squadron after they were deployed to North Africa in the spring of 1943. Once the 99th arrived, despite their eagerness for dogfights, they were kept far from important engagements and made aware by their leadership that there was no intention of depending on them as actual fighter pilots. Upset with their lack of meaningful contributions, members of the 99th wrote to their friends and family about their treatment. Once again, the African American community and its supporters ran a media campaign to pressure military officials. This time, they doubled down, not only pressuring for significant combat missions for the 99th, but also calling out the Army Air Corps for not having African American bomber crews at all. The strategy worked, and the 477th Medium Bombardment Group was created. The 477th was the last Tuskegee Airmen unit activated on January 15th, 1944 at Selfridge Airfield, Michigan. They're also the only African-American bomber crew from World War II at all. They never deployed to the Pacific as planned, but the availability of their oral histories and unique experiences in trying to get there makes them ideal subjects for contextualizing this decade of African-American service on the home front. From its creation, the 477th worked against the odds to complete training and reach combat. Veterans recount most of their leadership was openly racist and went out of their way to stifle the progress of African American airmen, most notably coming from Colonel Robert Selway. This wasn't Selway's fault, but after activation, the 477th was under strength. Under strength means that as of February 1944, of the 290 officers the unit was approved for, only 175 were present, and most were white training officers, so not the individuals who needed to be getting trained. Shortly after these numbers were reported, the rest of the unit's members arrived, but Selway ordered the now fully staffed 477th on the trains headed for Godman Field Air Base in Kentucky with no prior notice. Without a diary or his own words, we can't confirm his motivations, but veterans suggest that the move was to stall them from starting training in a timely manner, if not for fear of a recent race riot in Detroit spreading ideas to the airmen. And once again, this goes back to that long civil rights moment thing, as CORE and a lot of these other organizations are starting to pop up and they're starting to do the peaceful protests and things that we typically don't recognize until we get to the 50s and 60s. All of that's starting now. All of those organizations that are going at the moment, like CORE and the NAACP, a lot of times those members go on to form the organizations that we're more familiar with later on in the 50s and 60s. And then those people end up being more popular. Those individuals also end up being veterans in a lot of cases, which is why that connect ends up being made traditionally. But just a quick comparison of resources at Godman to those at Selfridge highlights the move's oddity. Even if race wasn't an issue, Selfridge had 4 times more hangar space than Godman, 7 times the acreage, 5 times the aviation gasoline capacity, more runways, and better flying weather. Even if the move wasn't heinous or racially motivated, this decision was not one that supported the 477th being prepared for combat as quickly as possible. Finally, and this is now a full year later, in the winter of 1945, the 477th began crew training, essential for operating as a six-person crew. B-25 crew included a pilot, co-pilot, a bombardier navigator, flight engineer, radio operator, and tail gunner. Each member had been trained in different locations and under various leadership styles before joining the 477th, which is why it took some time to come together as a cohesive unit. The B-25 itself was a new class of aircraft, and its usage was highly anticipated because it provided an ideal platform for fast, medium-range bombing, like what would be needed in the Pacific. The bombing that was going on in the European theater was using those B-17s to get up as high as we could in the atmosphere. Those gentlemen having to use oxygen, things like that, and just carpet bombs. So not really aiming all that great, but we're just aiming for a large area and hoping for the best, which is why we see those beautiful pictures of hundreds on hundreds of B-17s floating over Europe or different places. But you rarely ever see pictures of the B-25 in that way. Additionally, the bombardier navigator role, one of the most crucial positions in World War II bomber crews, was severely understaffed despite its significance. The 477th was allocated 128 bombardier navigators, but only 23 had arrived 9 months into the program. This shortage made it nearly impossible for the 477 to train in full crews like other bomber units at the time, forcing them to repeat basic training they had already completed for weeks, like parachute packing, classroom work, operating the weapon system, and maintenance. If you're familiar with the military and have been in yourself, then you know that monotonous tasks are like a staple of the military, but past a certain point, or at this point when we're trying to have airmen ready to go because we genuinely needed them, this doesn't make sense. You would be focused on training every day and getting them to the next thing. If you look at other units at this time, the main focus was getting them ready for training, and it was never just making them repeat rudimentary tasks just because. Alongside the issues with training, many of these airmen travel with their families, but because of various Jim Crow laws, the nearest safe and welcoming place for them was Louisville, Kentucky, about an hour's drive from Godman. If they couldn't go to Louisville, soldiers tried to bring their families together in the limited base housing available, which only a few could secure. Veteran interviews mentioned that the towns near Godman often refused to rent to them, and grocery stores would even turn away their families. Hardships that other members of the military or their families didn't have to face. Despite their experiences in the Jim Crow South, most veterans found moments to relax and have fun, or those with family made time for them. The average airman was older, typically about 26 to 27 years old, that had a high school and a college degree. They're professionally experienced, and most were from the northern United States, making this new life a culture shock for some who had experienced a milder kind of treatment than what was currently in front of them. And for anyone who just cringed when I said milder, I'm just using it because it's the easiest way to describe the difference between how they would have been treated while they're in the north to the south. There's not really a mild or a nice form of racism, it's just racism. Also, to take a second to pause here and tell you about what you're looking at. The document that's on the left is from the Green Book. If you're familiar with the movie or the literal Green Book, this is something that travelers needed if they're African Americans to know where it was safe for them to stay, where it was safe for them to get food, all sorts of things like that. So it's organized by state, and then from state, you have the towns or the cities based on whatever year that you have. So if you look at this one, this is Kentucky's page. It's very short. If you look at some other places, they go on for multiple pages. But if you look at Elizabethtown, which is closer to Radcliffe, Kentucky, if you're familiar with the area, and Glasgow, those sorts of things, that is out in the middle of nowhere. And then if you look to Hopkinsville, that's going to be a little bit better, but Louisville ends up having the most options for them, not only places to stay, but also things for them to do and the necessities of life. Like you see, like the restaurants, the beauty parlors, barbershops, stuff like that. That's what they would need. Most of those things are available on Fort Knox or at Godman, but not in the way that these gentlemen and the WACs, the Women's Auxiliary Corps that was there as well, would need. But because the Tuskegee Airmen were composed of African American scholars and athletes, sports and studying were the most common ways they passed the time. boxing, and football were taken very seriously and mentioned by name in interviews, but the base newspaper, the Godman Field Beacon, confirms that there were annual sporting tournaments of all kinds and dances with the African American Women's Auxiliary Units, which were assigned to Fort Knox right around the same time they were. Um, Coincidences in history are seldom. I don't think that them being assigned there at the same time was an accident. And as I get to some information later on, you'll hear exactly why I don't think so. But the image you're looking at right now is the 4 general officers that would have been at Fort Knox, and they're welcoming the Women's Auxiliary Corps that has just joined them. And then they also have a couple of the gentlemen who would have been leading the Black soldiers through basic at Fort Knox. And I think one of them is an aviation officer coming from Godman, but he doesn't have everything on, so I don't want to tell you all something that I'm not positive of. Service members competed against each other at Godman and sometimes against other units attached to Fort Knox. And for those not interested in sports, the 477th members interviewed report that they were constantly studying and quizzing one another, even when they were out. When soldiers received a weekend pass, it was common for them to go to Louisville for the nightlife and to be part of a larger African American community. This was usually accepted as long as their passes were not revoked, but one of the 477th veterans recalls having to arrange their own transportation to pick up drunken service members. To quote him, all the members of the 477th knew if the military police brought them back to base, they would be beaten before being dropped off, so they set up their own transportation service. And to be totally honest, when I was listening to this interview, this is one of those points where I stopped and rewinded it about 17 times because I didn't really think I was hearing what I was. But I was, in fact. And this is what we say, this is what we mean when we keep saying that there's so much more in the oral histories, because there's no way that the MPs at Fort Knox or Godman would have been writing this information down, because that's evidence of a crime. Another place for recreation was Weber Theater, Fort Knox's movie theater, but even that came with its own challenges. On June 30th, 1945, Captain Wilbur Wilson, the officer in charge of Weber Theater, told 2 African-American soldiers, "I don't give a damn about Julio's, the U.S. Adjutant General's, signature or any other. I give the orders at this theater, and you either sit in this colored section or get out." The same article says it was a directive which caused Colonel Butler Briscoe, the post commander, also one of those individuals featured in that last photo, to state he saw no reason for changing the segregation policy at the post theater, claiming never to have seen the War Department's order. Further defining the difference and the day-to-day experience of the 477th was the multiple interviews that say they watched German prisoners of war receive better treatment than they did. The 477th was not allowed inside the officers' club on Fort Knox, and they still lived under Jim Crow law. But in a cruel twist of fate, German POWs were treated with the same respect as white officers and were free to move about the base and local areas as they pleased. Simply saying this treatment was a byproduct of the time would be an easy justification, but I have yet to find a valid reason I could articulate professionally myself. This is actually a picture of those German POWs at Fort Knox getting loaded onto one of the trains. The best I could come up with was that we wanted the Germans to let down their guard and spill the last of Hitler's secrets about the rockets, but that's a stretch even for me. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, it's completely fine. But just know I've spent a lot of time researching this, and I still get really excited as I go through the details of it. But once again, my main point here is that there is much to gain from adding context to the fears of desegregation around the base and the responses it provoked as it unfolded. To try to make some sense of these feelings base leadership had towards the 477, I turned to historian Victoria Walcott, who studied the significance of shared recreational spaces, such as theaters and community swimming pools, covering the years we were discussing. Her work suggests that the tension in desegregating shared spaces was primarily connected to fears of interracial romance, as all of these spaces invited young men and women to mix. In the context of this research, 2 moments that support her assertion were the incident at the Weber Theater and the topic of U.S. Senators' debates as soldiers began returning home from Europe. Trigger warning, there is some coarse language coming next as I go through some of the quotes that I've gotten from the individuals that were leading the 477th and around. In one event, Senator Theodore Bilbo of Mississippi told Eisenhower in a two-page letter that Negrophile forces were advancing social equality in America, which would inevitably lead to familiarity, miscegenation, mongrelization, and in many cases, intermarriage between the races. In July 1945, a senator took to the floor to say, in Europe, the Negro has crossed the color line and has gone with white girls. He warned there will be no social equality when the soldier returns. Similarly, in September 1946, a Newsweek article that featured 4 photos of African Americans with European women was published. An elected official stated, for this disgraceful, repulsive, and obscene display, those black men very likely are on their way to be hanged from the limb of some big oak tree or to be burned alive at public lynchings by the white men of the South. Fort Knox's base commander, Colonel Briscoe, stated, I have known colored people all my life, grew up with them, and frankly, they have no desire to sit scattered around in the audience any more than other people have. What is creating the problem is a lot of goddamn agitators. This thing crops up now and then here. We got along all right at Fort Knox until this Air Corps came here. Briscoe was not alone in his sentiments, though, as Colonel Throckmorton, another officer on base during World War II, stated, we have 4 general officers living here on post, and by God, they just don't want a bunch of coons moving in next to them. Honestly, I wish these comments were hard to find, but the truth is that only a few quotes made it out to be shared. There were countless other conversations and closed-door talks about who the men of the 477th really were, what they truly wanted, and the threat that their mere existence represented. In response, members of the 477th reported to the War Department that they were not being treated fairly. So Commander of the Air Corps, Major General Frank Hunter, sent an intelligence agent to evaluate the situation. The report included several statements from white officers who expressed their contempt serving alongside African Americans. Some complained about the smell and were offended at the idea of equality. Others showed an eagerness for violence against their fellow officers, as one said, if one of them makes a crack at my wife, laughs or whistles at her, like I saw them do some white girls downtown, so help me, I'll kill him. Another boasted about participating in lynchings, saying, I killed 2 of them in my hometown, and it wouldn't bother me to do it again. After this formal investigation, the 477th was moved to Freeman Field in Indiana. In the eyes of the Air Corps, Indiana was out of the South and had resources to bring them up to speed on their training. Though well-intentioned, the move to Indiana was another disconnect between military officials and the reality that members of the 477th faced daily. Freeman Field provided the unit with much-needed space and resources. However, even though Indiana was geographically out of the South, the state still operated under Jim Crow laws. In addition to the relocation being ill-timed, the white officers responsible for leading their training remained in place with minimal reprimand despite several accounts of their failures to follow orders, leaving tensions between the 477th and their leadership at their most strained. Upon arriving at Freeman Field in March 1945, Selway immediately began reasserting his vision of how African-American airmen should be treated there. This time, however, he aimed to conceal his intentions through coded language to avoid further interference from the War Department. Despite mandates against such practices, Selway authorized the creation of 2 separate officers' clubs based on race. He ordered that one be designated as the Trainees Officer Club and the other as the Instructors Club. Conveniently, all trainees were African American officers and all the instructors were white. Based on the interviews with veterans, there was never any confusion about its purpose. It seems this action was the final straw that pushed the 477th towards the mutiny that would soon take place. And now the part we all came here for, the mutiny. So after their daily training and during their free time, members of the 477th started organizing what they believed would be the most effective demonstration to end the unfair treatment that endured to date. In April 1945, African American officers of the 477th carried out a planned peaceful protest. In small groups, African American officers entered the instructors club group by group, and group by group they were arrested. On the first night, 36 were taken into custody, and on the second night, 25 more were arrested. But this time, Selway ordered the club closed for the night. Interviews also mentioned that additional African-American officers waited nearby to see if the club would reopen again that night in anticipation of continuing their demonstration, but it didn't. Another detail only possible because of oral histories. The morning after, Selway ordered all members of the 477th to gather on the tarmac at Freeman Field to sign his new mandate, which assigned trainees and instructors to different facilities based on race. Selway sought to expand his segregation restrictions through Regulation 85-2, which designated specific housing, mess, and recreational facilities for officers by race. He demanded that the airmen sign a statement agreeing with the policy under threat of the 64th Article of War, which stated that any form of mutiny is punishable by death. Of the 422 African Americans assigned to the 477th, 101 chose not to sign and faced the consequences of mutiny. The 101 who refused were immediately loaded onto buses and trucks and taken to the stockades at Fort Knox. One veteran described it as 7-foot barbed wire enclosures patrolled by Southern troops looking for a reason to use their weapon. The other members of the 477th were kept at Freeman Field, but were not allowed to move freely for some time. Those who stayed at Freeman initially recalled joining the rest of the 477th in Kentucky shortly after the group was first sent off. But being transparent, this is the tricky part of matching oral histories with actual events to create a fluid timeline. I don't want to fill in the blanks for them because they don't specifically say this happened, then this, then this. However, we do have the information from the demonstration, the secret runway photo, and the subsequent trial to serve as our timeline markers. So everything that they're describing is well on track for it being appropriate. During the period between the mutiny and the airmen's trial, 110 officers from the 477th wrote to the Army Inspector General to investigate the arrest, while others reached out to the NAACP and news outlets, who once again started a media campaign on their behalf. There is a trend going here, and it sounds like the civil rights movement to me. The why as to Selway's actions is complicated, because simply attributing the motives of the white officers leading the 477th to prejudice and fear would be a drastic oversimplification of feelings we may never be able to understand fully. And quite frankly, I try not to get bogged down with finding the reason here because it's likely there isn't a good one. Truthfully, for all the excitement about getting here to the mutiny, the initial conclusion was underwhelming, but it once again brought the 477th into the news for something besides success in combat. Following the advice of the judge's advocate on April 7th, Selway released all of the African American officers except 3, Roger Terry, Marson Thomas, Shirley Clinton. The 3 who were not released faced trial because they were accused of jostling a superior officer during a demonstration. Jostling a superior officer, in quotes, is what they were actually being charged with. During their trial, Selway's case quickly unraveled as fellow white officers testified in support of the 477th, and it became clear that his regulations violated the new mandates established by the War Department. The only justice, if any, that Selway received was that Terry was found guilty and fined $150 for pushing the marshal trying to arrest him. But for anyone curious, $150 in 1946 is roughly $2,500 today. So it was indeed a sizable fine, but the decision against him was set aside in 1995. The final support the 477th received came the following May. President Harry Truman, who after hearing about the incidents in Indiana and Kentucky, sent the Army Chief of Staff, General George Marshall, to quote unquote fix it. Marshall's solution was to assign Commander General Henry Arnold and Colonel Benjamin Davis Jr., 2 already well-known African-American Air Corps officers, to lead the 477th. They had previously been leading the 332nd and basically all the other flight groups that were actually in combat. With new leadership in place, the goal was for the 477th to complete its final training and begin flying bombing missions in the Pacific during the mainland invasion of Japan. Sadly, for the 477th, they never saw combat despite their renewed optimism and leadership. According to the World News and interviews, the 477th was fully ready to deploy, but the first atomic bomb was dropped on August 6, 1945, and the second on August 9th, with Japan surrendering 6 days later, eliminating the need for a mainland invasion and the 477th. And now I must attempt to land this plane in our closing moments. Thank you all for staying with me so far. We've gotten to the fun stuff. So in relation to World War II, this marked the end of the 477th story. And to be totally honest, Selway was successful in keeping them grounded. It's not something that we like to admit as historians sometimes, I feel, but it's the truth. He was successful. They did not make it to combat, and many of them didn't get to do anything else besides being a part of the 477th. But for this concluding section, I want to walk you all through my logic over the last few years that I've been doing this research as I still try to decide what the big takeaway here should be. To borrow the words of someone much smarter than me, a cool story, but so what? And what part of this is about remembering a different way? There are countless stories of African American veterans achieving remarkable things despite adversity, and we are sure to discover more if we keep looking. So, why is the 477th any more special than other groups of unsung heroes? Did individuals who serve go on to do standout things? Did their service lead to major policy changes for the armed services in the country? Or is their story still just a small part of a much larger issue? In a word, yes. But once again, so what? Gotta dig deeper. The legacy of the 477th is that their experiences serving on the home front during World War II linked the armed forces and the federal government to the early stages of the long civil rights movement, which began in the 1930s. Additionally, the only reason we have multiple perspectives on the events surrounding the mutiny is because the 477th oral histories and newspapers, primarily Black-owned newspapers. After the mutiny, the military tried to move on quickly, but years later, once the country's attitudes towards race shifted, some efforts were made to retell their story. When these articles are compared with the Veterans History Project interviews, which is what I'm pulling a lot of this material from, the 477th veterans often share more detail and emotion than the Air Corps did in the military's official accounts. And I know what you're thinking, Tim, that information is not important when you're writing up a report for the military. I would argue it is because if you look in other places, there are plenty of times that they're talking about the morale of soldiers. And if you're not being treated right, you would still write down the morale of soldiers and why their morale is low. Their morale is low because they're being treated like X. That's not the treatment they receive, though. As I mentioned earlier, the problem with using oral histories, however, is that we have to prove they are correct. But how do we confirm they were there, especially when no primary source material specifically places them or names the event, and articles on these topics keep getting deleted? Honestly, this is the hard part of the work, and I don't have a good answer besides determination and luck and maybe some passion. But there is an obvious value in using oral histories more to fill in the gaps, as I hope I've demonstrated with this presentation so far. Currently, I no longer have access to at least two articles that were once publicly available on a .gov website because they were considered not to support a specific narrative about our armed forces, so they were removed or blocked. And I'm sure many of you can say the same things if you were looking at any topics that would have been considered under DEI or anything close to. It's honestly kind of scary times, especially when this is the material we're covering and we are getting closer and closer back to those sorts of things. But like many other people here, I felt an immediate fear and frustration when that access was being cut off. But the more I thought about it, the more the situation actually has reinvigorated my passion for the field, especially with making the nuances of collected and collective history. Dinner table conversations are things that people are just regularly talking about. So how am I remembering their service in a different way? For those who may not know, loosely, collective memory is the history that gets written down and taught in schools, while collective memory is about how a group remembers that same event. And if you could guess, the two often have varying points of emphasis and expressed emotions, especially when we start talking about the experiences of minority populations. The example I've used for students is naming the Korean War the Korean War. South Korea doesn't call it the Korean War, it calls it the 625 War because that's the day they were invaded, while North Korea calls it the Fatherland Liberation War because they felt like they were reuniting the peninsula. And China calls it the war to resist US aggression and aid Korea, which is a bit on the nose for me, but I hope this really illustrates the concept to some degree for you. But the main point about memory here is that lived experience shapes our perception of events and their importance all the way down to what we should call them. But the history documented of Black service during World War II, whether in written records or digitally, typically appears homogenized to fit industry standards for similar materials. Now, please humor me for a second as I try and rush to a close, but everyone close your eyes for me and tell me if this scenario sounds familiar. Now ready to work on conquering racism in America, the country opens up the military for African Americans and other persons of color. Now, this ragtag group that we've just met, originating from humble beginnings, is forced, some are compelled to serve. As soon as they start training, they overcome unfair treatment, but this certainly won't be the last time they have to. They survived training and grew some, but once settled in a foreign land, the ragtag group realizes it may be no different from home. But after fighting a battle or overcoming a difficult task everyone once thought impossible, they earn the respect of their white peers, and then everyone gets along. After that, their experience is positive and patriotic, but we are soon reminded of the human cost of war, which grounds us in reality just before a final major victory. Those who survive go home and teach their children about interracial cooperation and cue the credits. You can open your eyes now if you have them closed. Thank you for humoring me. In script writing, at least, cliches help us understand the basics of the story and fill in the gaps we assume are obvious to the audience when there isn't enough time on screen to fully explain a situation or a character's motivation. For example, in the 6888, Netflix's most recent African American history film, we meet the core characters. You probably can pick out who is supposed to be the sassy, takes no mess friend, the stoic one who likes nice things, and the two who are destined to be best friends for life. Even without seeing the film, you could probably get that from this image alone. I love working with film and short form content because it's easy to see how cliches and standard formulas help us tell stories quickly. And the same things could be applied to many articles and books on similar topics. However, for most people, film and short form content are more entertaining and can be educational. So why not use them more? I'd wager that more people have watched the 6888, Devotion, Men of Honor, or Red Tails than have read Torchbearers of Democracy, The Marines of Munford Point, Half American, or any of the other titles that talk about the 20th century in this regard. And now, just to be plain, I'm not saying books, articles, and the peer review process needs to go away. Quite the opposite. I believe the better academic integration of film and media is the future of remembering things differently. Instead of shying away from film and its relationship with not always telling accurate histories in lieu of entertainment, Saving Private Ryan, I am looking at you. Why not meet them in the middle by contributing to an academically accurate and entertaining documentary or short form content that can continue the conversation with the facts that fill in the blanks we as historians often complain about, but no one else notices. Using my most recent work as an example, I wrote short articles about the experience of African American women in the Army currently, and I have followed that up by recording oral histories that you can find on my website on a similar topic. But I'll also be pitching this information to another documentary producer, and I still think there's more and better work to be done, but it's hard to do it alone. So let's all collaborate as much as possible and create the materials we wish we had when we started our own research projects. And the last thing I'll say before we transition to our Q&A is that I challenge all of you to remember your historical passion a different way. The nuance or wow factor we are being asked for may not come from uncovering a brand new story, but rather from your ability to repurpose the same research into educational and entertaining content that can serve as a resource for a new generation of learners. And once again, I just want to say thank you all for your time today. That is the end of my formal portion. I think I have one more picture for you here. So the only way that this photo made its way out, all of the other cameras and things like that from that day were destroyed, according to one of the veterans. This picture was taken on a hidden camera, like the guy had it in his trench coat and like took it. If you know what cameras look like in the 1940s, you know this wasn't really hidden, which makes me chuckle every time I think of it. But we're seeing here that the people that were in the event are the reason why we were actually able to have materials left over. And then if you want any more information, up here on the screen is kind of an overview of everything I just talked about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim, for that fantastic presentation. I loved all of the visuals and that you walked us through both how you approach the research, but also how you're continuing to approach how you interpret that and make meaning out of it. We already have some questions coming in, and folks feel free to add your questions for Tim either in the Q&A function or in the chat. Our first question is from Michael Binder, who asks, Do you know of any anti-segregation actions at Camp Roberts in California, which had separate white and black cantonments?
I am, or let me not say I am, I have heard lightly. So one of the things I enjoy doing is going around to all the bases and things like that. I've heard that story tangentially while I was visiting to look at the planes. And then March Airfield here, which is in Riverside, I believe, or a little bit outside Riverside, they actually still have B-25s that are not serviceable. They don't fly anymore, but you are able to walk around them and see more. And a lot of the stories that they have are about these sorts of things. How are the people here in California? Out west in general dealing with segregation in comparison to the opposite side of the country. And that is a nuance that I really enjoy talking about in different circles.
Thank you. Our next question is from Nicole Martin, and Nicole writes, "Thank you for such an engaging talk. I was wondering, considering what is happening with disappearing sources, are you trying to save what you can now and archive them personally? Or I'd love to hear other thoughts about how you're thinking about moving forward as researching and writing this type of history continues to get more difficult."
Oh my goodness, Nicole, that's an amazing question. Thank you so much. So I'm doing a few things actually. So for some sources that I have fears of, slash, I think that they would just magically disappear, I do try and keep a copy of them. Like the Godman Field Beacon, I was told, I don't think it's true because I've seen a few other clips other places, but the people there told me that I am one of the few people who actually have a full record of the entire newspaper because most people don't know it exists. So I keep that. I have two copies of it on two different flash drives that are kept in two different places at all times. In addition to, I have other general materials that I've been able to scan from other places. Genuinely, just whenever I get material that I think is going to be able to be used later on, or I just think it may help someone else, I try and save it. And one of the places I try and save those things is on my website. So one of the sections is just museums and history stuff, essentially. And you'll see me posting pictures, videos, and things like that of me actually interacting with some of these things. And it's the fun way of how I've stored that material for myself. And as things get deleted, unfortunately, you don't always know what's going to get deleted, so it's hard to know which articles are the best one. When I was mentioning .gov websites, I really hope no one throws a rock at me, but it was the Army and the Air Force. But they both had multiple articles removed during that whole DEI scare. So you can assume certain organizations are going to lose some, but then some other ones from small organizations that are still connected. They are able to keep their materials, but same thing, you start having to look in obscure places to get it, and you do need to store it. And then a YouTube channel as well for oral histories and things of that nature, because that is private property that people can't take unless it's doing something offensive, and then you got to get lawyers for that. But yes.
Thank you. And if you don't mind, maybe after the talk, you could share a link with us to your website, and we can share that with everyone along with the recording after the fact.
Mhm.
Um, Tatiana Painter writes, "Thank you for this wonderful presentation, Tim. You mentioned that African American service members had trouble finding housing and were turned away from grocery stores when they moved to the bases with their families. My question is, do you think the rejection the African American service members faced at some of these places could have also been the result of communities not wanting new people moving into their areas, in addition to race? In my research on the Nebraska home front, I found that there were some communities who did not particularly like having so many new people moving in their regions or areas. I've also seen this today here in Okinawa, Japan, with our own service members."
Yes, that is an amazing question. And you are 100% right. That is a logical and valid reason for why people may not want someone joining. I kind of left these parts out because even for me, I do think they're a bit tangential. But when these soldiers are moving into these towns around Fort Knox, I've also had the pleasure of living in one of the towns around Fort Knox and living on base at Fort Knox. That area is destitute and there's absolutely nothing there. And it has been nothing there since before this time. The reason that Fort Knox was picked out in the first place was because of its isolation and because of the Federal Reserve there and all that jazz. But then the towns outside of there, the next closest towns, they just or Jim Crow towns or sundown towns, which there are several of through Kentucky, especially when you start venturing through those parts. So in their case, I do think it's that. But I think as you're discussing, I think different populations, you really have to listen to their oral histories, do more research, because their motivations for not wanting a group there may be like you're saying, like this is messing up our population and it's causing inflation. This is ridiculous. So that's very different than a group of people who are genuinely just like, oh, you all are this group of people. I don't like you here. And that is more of the energy that a lot of these individuals were getting. And to be totally honest, the people being turned away and the reason why it is a kind of like a jab in the chest is not the airmen themselves, but it's the airmen's families. So imagine mom and child are genuinely just trying to go and get food at the nearest convenience store, and which is the small town you live in now, because this is where you all live. And you're no longer able to do that. So for you to get groceries, you now have to drive an hour, if you even can drive an hour, or you have to carpool or bus pool, in this case, an hour. This is where you really start to see those ties into community and them wanting to create their own spaces so that there were things available for them. But this is an extremely good question.
Thank you. Our next question is from Andrew Dixon, who writes, regarding your statements about the African-American troops feeling the German POWs were getting better treatment, in the book Access Prisoners of War in Kentucky, Behind Barbed Wire in the Bluegrass State by Antonio Thompson, Thompson argues that German and Italian POWs were treated well for the hopes that when they wrote back to their comrades, the American POWs held in Europe would be treated the same. His source for this is based on the Louisville-based newspaper, the Courier-Journal. Thompson goes into more detail about how well the POWs were treated on the War Department's money. With that being said, what are your thoughts on the POWs being treated differently than members of the 477th?
That is a really good question. I've actually seen the Courier Journal article. I don't have it saved anymore, but that is something that I wrestled with because, forgive me, but someone always has a question that's like kind of poking at it. So this is one of those ones. I do agree with you. I think that a part of it is because they wanted their fellow troops to be treated the same overseas. But one thing that we see, and it's not something that I really harped on here, but the experience, black or white, if you are a service member at home, is drastically different than if you're a service member deployed. Service members deployed very frequently discuss losing even the idea of race while they're interacting with these individuals, even if it's not someone that they see regularly. So the idea of them being in a foxhole together stops being crazy after, you guys save each other in battle, or you like, no, they were fighting next to us. There's a few psychology reports on it as well. But when you look over here, most of the individuals that were being asked to guard and do things of that nature here were not deployed. They weren't leaving Fort Knox and doing anything. Those were just good old Kentucky boys hanging out, which is why the gentleman, when he makes that comment, it's just like they're just Southerners just looking for a reason to use their gun. Because something else he goes on to continue to say is that a lot of the other people around Fort Knox by this time, as the war is dwindling down, we don't need a bunch of tanks in Europe anymore. It's like 1945, 1946 by this point. We aren't deploying that much. If anything, we're sending aircrafts and airmen and things of that nature because it's easier to conduct a war from that front. This is a very good question.
Thank you so much. And Andrew put his thanks into the chat for that great answer. As we're nearing the top of the hour, I want to say thank you again to Tim for sharing your research and these incredible images and the story with all of us today. Thank you to the Park Service for making this possible and for working together with NCPH to make sure that these stories are told and that we're encouraging our public history community to think and rethink about how we're interpreting history for our publics. As a reminder, we will share out the links to this recording as well as the other 3 presentations in this series in a follow-up email early next week. And Tim, if you have any resources that you want to make sure that we're sharing out to folks, we will include those there as well. Any closing remarks that you'd like to make before we sign out, Tim?
No, I just want to once again say thank you to everyone who had a hand in making this possible for us today, and the entire week, in all honesty. Doing this work is not easy, and it's also very scary to be able to share these opinions and points of view because you never know, and then your research just ends up not being available anymore. So thank you all for having us. Thank you for navigating the shutdown and everything else for us. Just thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. All right, everyone, enjoy your weekend.